I'm an English teacher in Korea, but I won't tell you where I teach in order to protect the identity of both the students and teachers. I'm half Korean and moved to Korea from the States about a year ago so I could learn more about the Korean culture. Anyway, ever since I moved here, I've been experiencing some weird stuff, things that I can't explain. Here are just some of the things that I experienced, or others I know experienced. The second week of me teaching at the school, I began to hear this clicking sound, like somebody clicking their tongue, but louder. I looked around my classroom to see if anybody else noticed it, but they didn't seem to, so I shrugged it off. Later though, in the teacher's lounge, I asked another English teacher if she ever heard the clicking noise. She nods her head and then proceeds to tell me about something that happened to her. About 2 years ago, the classroom she taught in was being renovated, so her and several other teachers were moved to a wing of the school that had not been used in 5 years. To get an idea of what the school looks like, just picture the high school in the Korean horror movie, Whispering Corridors, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the teacher had to go to the bathroom, and the girls' bathroom was located on the abandoned floor upstairs. She stepped out of the classroom, turned right and rounded the stairwell until she reached the top and looked down at the long abandoned hallway, which made her feel uneasy. As she quickly entered the bathroom, she noticed the doors to all 5 stalls were opened, so she knew she was alone. She entered the first stall to do her business, and just as she was about to sit down, she began to hear a clicking noise. Looking through the cracks in the stall, she notices somebody standing outside. At this point, she freaks out, and so she quickly gets up, exits the stall, and as she does, she sees a girl standing there with her head down, swaying from side to side. Feeling a bit creeped out, she nervously asked the girl in Korean if she was okay, but no answer. Again, she asks the girl if she was okay, and this time the girl stops swaying, slowly lifts her head, and lets out a blood-curdling wail. Needless to say, she never used that bathroom again, but it was hard to avoid entirely because it was situated right above her classroom, and so, she would often hear footsteps. Other times, she would hear the water running or the toilets flushing, and the ceiling in her class would always drip water, even after the water was turned off. One time, her class was taking a test, and all of a sudden they were interrupted by an ear-piercing scream coming from the bathroom. This freaked her students out, so she immediately notified security and they went up to investigate, but found nothing. After that incident, the floor was closed off for good. Another teacher who's Korean and speaks English really well told me this story. Last year, in another wing of the school, one of her students had to go to the bathroom. 5 minutes later, the student comes running back to the classroom, visibly shaken and screaming. Finally, after calming the student down, the teacher notified security, and when they arrived, she accompanied them to the bathroom. She told me that when they entered the bathroom, they found clumps of black hair, some of it on the floor and some of it in the toilets. As for the student, well, she wasn't the same after that incident and never told the teacher what happened to her that day in the bathroom. This last story I'm going to share with you actually happened to me. It was around the 3rd month of me teaching at this school when the principal asked me to tutor some of the students after school. I received the list of all the students that were in my class, and there was 15 in total. On my first afternoon of tutoring, I began counting the students and noticed there were 16. Thinking the school added another student without telling me, I looked down at my list and saw there were only supposed to be 15 in my class. Puzzled, I recounted, and this time there were only 15 students. I never found out who the 16th student was, and I really didn't want to find out either. Well, I have a meeting tomorrow, so I'll have to wrap it up for now, but I definitely have more stories to share with you at a later time. Okay guys, as promised, here's some more of the strange things I've encountered in Korea. Several months ago, I was taking the train home from work. It was around 9 at night, and the Busan metro station was practically empty. As I began walking towards my train, I began to hear the sound of dragging feet behind me. Scared, I began to quicken my pace and noticed that the footsteps behind me began to move at a faster pace. Panicked, I began to run, and after reaching my train, I quickly jumped in, and it was then that I was met with a gruesome sight. Inside the train's car, I saw at least a dozen mangled bodies. I saw blood on the walls, and I could hear all the injured passengers moaning in pain as they cried out for help. It was at this point I began to feel dizzy, and soon after, I passed out. When I finally came to, I realized that all the bodies were gone and that the car looked normal again, like it was never in an accident in the first place. Later, I did some research and found out that about 20 years ago, there was a train that derailed at the Busan Metro, killing 12 people and injuring 20 more. They say now the train station is haunted by those people who were killed in that tragic accident. Some people claim to hear feet dragging near Platform 8, especially at night, while others claim to hear a loud crash, only to find the tracks empty of any train. Workers at the Busan Metro also report experiencing strange things. Like one day a worker claimed that he saw a young woman that appeared to be injured standing in the middle of the tracks with her head down. When he approached her to see if she was okay, she vanished. There is also a rumor of a strange creature that roams the subterranean part of the train station near Platform 4. Several people have reported being attacked by this creature, and witnesses describe it as being pale-skinned with no hair and glowing red eyes. Nobody knows when the creature first appeared at the station, but it's rumored that the creature was once a man that was cursed for his misdeeds. The other story I'm about to tell you involves another teacher at my school. About 6 months ago or so, this particular teacher was at the Busan Metro, waiting for her train to arrive. It was late at night, so there were only a few other people waiting on the platform with her. When the train finally arrived, she stepped into the train and noticed that she was the only person in the car. As the train started to move, she started to doze off, and when she opened her eyes a few minutes later, she noticed that there was an elderly man wearing an old tweed suit sitting straight across from her. She felt him staring at her, making her feel a bit uneasy, causing her to get up and move to another seat. As she sat down, she turned back to see if the man was still staring at her, but he was gone. This last story happened to be a security guard at my school, who used to be a security supervisor in the Busan Metro. Late one night, he was looking at the security monitors when he noticed people standing on Platform 8. Puzzled, he quickly radioed into the guard that was patrolling the area and asked him if he saw any people. Confused, the guard radios in to tell him that, in fact, the platform was empty and the station was supposed to be closed for the night. The security supervisor, still seeing the people on the platform, radios to the patrolling guard again to ask him if he was playing a prank on him, and before the guard could answer, the security supervisor glances over at the monitors and saw that the platform was now empty. That was only one of many experiences he had on Platform 8, but I'll save these stories for another time. Well, I guess I'll wrap it up for now because I'm not feeling well, but I will return later with some more of my scary experiences from Korea when I feel better. In truth, something happened to me last night that I feel I need to tell you. I'm still a bit shaken up by it, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest, so here goes. Last night I was at the school, prepping assignments for the next day when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside of my classroom. Thinking that it was either the janitor or the security guard, I shrugged it off and went about my business. An hour later, as I was finishing up the last of my assignments, the lights in the classroom began to flicker. Then for some reason, I looked towards the middle of the classroom and see a girl sitting on one of the desks with her head down. Although something felt off about her. I thought it was just a student that got locked in. I wanted to confront her, but as soon as I stood up from my desk, the lights go out and now it's completely dark in the classroom. I felt my heart race as I tried to suppress my fear. Then I heard the same clicking sound from before as I looked at the girl to see if she was okay. I saw that she was now standing a few feet away from my desk. I knew then she was no student. Terrified, I ran out of the classroom screaming. As I was running down the hallway, I could clearly hear footsteps behind me, but they weren't running. I started screaming for help, hoping that either the security guard or the janitor would hear me. As I continued to run, I felt something on my back and my legs getting heavy. My vision started to blur, and just before I fainted, I could hear the girl's laughter throughout the hallway. The guard found me a few minutes later, and only when I was able to stand up again, we went back to the classroom to investigate, and to no surprise, found that it was now empty. Today, I took the day off. but later on I'll call the school up to see if they could assign me to another classroom. Until then, I think I'll go get some rest, but I'll try to keep you guys posted. Okay, guys, something happened to me a couple of days ago that I want to share with you. Here goes. It was after school about 2 days ago, when I was told by the principal to move some of the older and damaged chairs to the basement. The school was trying to replace the old chairs due to an accident last week. Anyway, to get an idea of what the basement is like, well, just imagine the abandoned part of the school I told you about earlier, add some creep factor in the mix, and you'll know what I'm talking about. In fact, the entrance to the basement is situated right next to the now closed-off wing that had since been boarded up due to the last incident. Anyway, I, along with 3 other teachers, were moving the chairs into the basement using an old elevator. It's located right next to the stairwell leading downstairs. After we loaded the elevator with the chairs, we stepped in and took the elevator down to the basement. Stepping out, the atmosphere was gloomy and the air was musty, causing us to cough after only a few seconds of being down there. Finally, after our coughing fit was over, curiosity got the better of us and we decided to roam around the dark recesses of the basement, completely forgetting why we were here in the first place. There were only several lights in the basement, so the visibility was very limited, so I took out my phone and used the flashlight. Walking around the basement, I noticed several hallways that were in the shape of a T and what appeared to be several rooms that littered them. Curious, I peered into one of the rooms and I saw several rusty desks and a chalkboard with writing still on it. I began to walk the whole basement and counted 12 classrooms in all. I noticed 4 of the classrooms were located directly under the now closed-off wing of the school. The school either forgot or assumed that none of the students had access to the basement, so they didn't bother boarding these classrooms up. Anyway, walking down the abandoned part of the floor, I saw there was only one light illuminating the entire section. Using my phone, I continued on and slowly studied everything I did. I noticed the bathroom first, which was located on the right side of the hall. When I entered it, I saw that the floor was flooded with stagnant water and sewage which smelled really bad. The bathroom itself was beyond repair with years of built-up grime and the doors of the bathroom stalls nearly falling off their hinges. After I exited the bathroom, I continued down the hall and I noticed my phone began to flicker. As I neared the last classroom at the end of the hall, I began to hear some static coming from my phone. I moved my phone around to try and get a better signal, and that's when the static stopped. Upon entering the classroom, I noticed it appeared to be daylight and that some light was streaming through the basement windows. There were about 20 students sitting in their desks, and all of them were dressed oddly in 50s-style clothing. It felt like I went back in time. I called out to them, but nobody seemed to notice me, and although I could see the students, I couldn't hear them. It felt like I was in some vacuum where all the sound was being sucked out. Not sure if what I was seeing was real or not, I began rubbing my eyes, and when I opened them again, all the students were still there. I stood there in a moment in shock, as I tried to process what the hell I was witnessing. And that's when I heard what sounded like nails on a chalkboard coming from the front of the classroom. As I turned to see what was causing that annoying sound, my heart nearly stopped. What I saw was a female student writing in Korean, "Help me," over and over again on the chalkboard. I screamed loudly and saw that she and the rest of the students had turned their heads towards me. I had no recollection of running out of the classroom, or how I was even able to find the other teachers, but nonetheless they were happy to see me. Apparently I had been missing for about 3 hours, although I knew I'd only been gone for 30 minutes. The next day, while moving the chairs again, I got brave and decided to go back to the same classroom to see if I was imagining it. When I got there, the classroom was gone, and instead, there was a wall in its place. Later that night when I got home, I decided to do some investigating and found out that in the 30s and 40s, the school was a hospital. After the hospital closed down, it was turned into a school. 2 years after the school was opened, a fire erupted in the basement, killing 10 students. The cause of the fire was unknown. I also found out that the basement, along with the now closed-off wing, was part of the original school. Oh, and before I forget, one of the teachers in our group also had his own experience that day too. While we were all working, he had to go to the bathroom. Well, walking up the stairs, he heard what sounded like banging coming from nearby. He assumed it was the other teachers banging the chairs around as they moved them, so he shrugged it off, resuming his trip to the bathroom. As he was walking past the boarded wall, he heard loud scratching coming from behind it. At this point, he's scared and runs into the bathroom, which is sort of situated across the basement stairs. Chalking it up to the rats, he finishes in the bathroom and heads back down to the basement. Again, as he's passing by the boarded-up wall, he could hear the scratching sound, but this time, it's accompanied by a girl's pleading voice saying, "Help me," over and over in Korean. Needless to say, he didn't stick around, and instead ran into the basement where he relayed to us what happened. Thinking somehow a student got trapped inside the building, we immediately notified security, where they entered the closed-off wing through a door that was accessible from the basement. Despite a thorough search, though, they never found the girl. I wonder if what I saw and what the other teachers saw is somehow connected. Anyway, that's what's been happening with me. I hope I didn't scare you too much. I'm headed to bed, so I'll end it for now, but I'll try to keep you guys updated because I definitely have more stories for you. Till then, have a good night. Okay guys, about 3 days ago something happened to me after visiting a well-known abandoned psychiatric hospital that I felt I needed to share with you. Here's what I experienced at Gdokim Psychiatric Hospital. As I was saying, about 3 days ago, a couple of my friends from the States came to visit me in Korea. One of them, John, who is an urban explorer, he even has his own YouTube channel. He'd heard about the Gdokim Psychiatric Hospital in Gongju, South Korea, from some urban exploration forums. He wanted to go there himself so he could film then upload the video onto his YouTube channel. Little is known about the Gdokim Psychiatric Hospital except that about 10 years ago, it was forced to close down due to some mysterious circumstances, causing the owner to flee the country. It's also said to be haunted by a doctor who performed lobotomies and other gruesome experiments on his patients. He was finally caught, but before he could stand trial for the murders, he was killed by one of his patients. Anyway, we decided to travel to Gongju, where we would stay for about 2 nights, one at the Gdokim Hospital and the other at a nearby hotel. We arrived at Gongju around 6 p.m., and using the maps on our phones, we were able to locate Gdokim relatively quickly, where we entered the hospital around 7:30 p.m. Upon entering the hospital, I was hit by a foul smell like something crawled up and had died in there. But despite the smell, the hospital was still in fairly good condition. I started to take pictures of the interior and noticed somebody had written, "It's not so scary during the day, but at night," on the walls, causing me to panic for a second. After finishing up the last picture, I met up with my friends. Both Leah and I were each given a map of the hospital by John, and each assigned different floors we'd be exploring. I was assigned the first floor, Leah the second, and John the third, and since there was so much ground to cover, we all agreed to keep in touch through video chat. Within an hour of me exploring the first floor, I swear I could hear somebody whispering my name, but I chalked it up to my imagination and told myself that I'd never step foot in this place again. I was that freaked out. 30 minutes had passed since the whispering incident when I realized that it was way too quiet and that I hadn't heard from my friends for a while. I called out to them through my headset. John replied and asked me if I was alright. I answered yeah. I told him that I was checking up on them because they were way too quiet. He laughed at me and then told me that I was being paranoid. I resumed my exploration, and as I was rounding a corner, I thought I saw a woman walking ahead. Thinking it was Leah, I called out to her but got no reply. "Very funny, Leah," I said through the headsets. "What the hell are you talking about?" Leah asked. "Never mind," I said. I followed the woman and saw that she had entered the nurse's station. There I felt a draft of air coming from a hole in the wall, and I began to break away at the wall without much effort. Eventually, I found a door that wasn't on the map. I quickly notified my friends, but our conversation began to break up. I attempted to communicate with them again to let them know. I was going to explore what was behind that door. Standing in front of the door, I could feel a draft coming from under it. I nervously reached for the doorknob, and out to my surprise, it was unlocked. When I opened it, I spotted a set of stairs that seemed to lead down to what I assumed was the hospital basement. I noticed that it was pitch black as I descended down from the stairs, and it was hard to see anything in front of me. I switched on my headlamp and saw a huge room. I noticed that the room connected to a labyrinth of tunnel systems, and in the center of the room was a weird contraption. It reminded me of the contraption that was used on Alex in the movie A Clockwork Orange. Thinking I stumbled into something important, I shouted for my friends to look as I showed them my find through video chat. John told me to stay put as him and Leah were on their way to find me. While I waited for them, I started to take pictures of it when I felt something grab my ankle, causing me to trip and twist my ankle in the process. I started screaming for both of them to come and help me. I told them I fell and hurt my ankle. They were nearby and told me to stay put, so I waited for them. As I waited for them, I began to talk to them through video chat to help me stay calm. John apologized to me and told me that if we made it out of here, he would make it up to me and treat me to dinner, anything to keep me calm. As I continued chatting with John and Leah, I noticed that they had stopped talking. I asked them what the hell was going on, and then John asked who that person was standing behind me. Nervously, I turned my head and nobody was there. "Is this your meaning of a joke?" I asked, but he just nodded his head. I desperately scooted myself towards the nearest wall. I then used my phone to look up the area where I fell and started to scream because there stood a doctor staring at me with this grin on his face. His eyes seemed to glow, his skin had a deathly blue pallor to it, and his clothes looked disheveled. I continued to stare as the doctor slowly opened his mouth, revealing red teeth. Unable to move, I began to scream at the top of my lungs. It was at this point that John and Leah burst into the room, grabbed me from under my arms, and started dragging me out. Before we could exit the room, though, we heard a loud, ear-piercing scream coming from behind us. We turned to see what was making the noise, and that's when we saw the doctor standing near the entrance to the tunnels. His face seemed different now, and his mouth opened wider, revealing even more red teeth. He stood there staring at us for several seconds before he began to make chase, and caused the three of us to run like hell. We didn't look back once until we were safely out of the hospital. That was 3 days ago. I was released from the hospital today, and I'm at home now where I'm typing this out. I feel like I'm not alone though, because you see, I think something followed me home, and I swear I keep seeing the doctor everywhere in my apartment. Anyway, I'm thinking about calling somebody to come bless my apartment, but if anything else happens between that time, I'll keep you guys posted. I need to get some sleep because I haven't been sleeping since my terrifying experience at Ganjam Psychiatric Hospital. The story I'm about to tell you happened to me on Friday, and I'm still a bit shaken up by the whole incident. Remember the group of teachers that helped me move the chairs to the basement? Well, one night after school, one of them, I can't recall who, suggested we go to a karaoke bar, or noraebang, as it's called in Korea. This particular karaoke bar was located downtown and was very popular with the foreigners. After a hectic week at the school, we all agreed it was a good idea and decided that 7 p.m. would be a great time for all of us to meet up. When I arrived at 6:54, the other teachers were already there. We entered the karaoke bar and noticed that it was quite crowded, but it was a Friday night, so it wasn't unusual. Anyway, we were able to rent a room fairly easy, and we were given room 7. On the way to our room, the teachers who suggested this bar in the first place begins to tell us this creepy story. About 3 years ago, there was a middle-aged man who used to work here. He was a rather creepy old man that liked to spy on the women who patroned the karaoke bar. This went on for several years until one day he was caught by one of the managers. Afterward, the man was fired, but before he was kicked out for good, he swore revenge on the manager who fired him. A few days later, the man returned with a large knife and ended up stabbing 10 people, killing 5. Eventually, though, the police surrounded the place. With no place to go, the man took his own life in one of the karaoke rooms. Another twist of the story is in the room where he killed himself is also where he killed 5 people. They say now that him, along with the people that he killed on that fateful day, still haunt this place. As we ordered our drinks and picked out our songs, that same teacher told another story. This story she'd heard from a friend that used to work here part-time. There's one restroom in the bar that no matter how many times the staff replaces them, mirrors seem to fall and break when nobody else is around. The story behind this is about 6 years ago. A man found out that his wife was cheating on him, then confronted her and her lover at the karaoke bar. He chased her in the ladies' room, where he then killed her with a piece of broken mirror. It's this restroom with the falling mirrors. Some women reported seeing the reflection of a woman smiling in the mirror, yet there's nobody else in the restroom with them. The woman described feeling fear and dread after seeing the smiling woman. Anyway, to get back to what happened to me, 45 minutes had passed since we first entered the room, and of course, we were singing our hearts out, when all of a sudden the song began to change, almost like the sound of a tape recorder makes when the cassette tape is being eaten. Then, to make matters worse, the monitor with the song lyrics started to flicker, showing a man's face with several different expressions. As this was happening, we could also hear a man's voice coming through the headset, but we couldn't make out what he was saying. The whole thing lasted 5 minutes or so before the man's face finally vanished from the monitor, and the voice in the headset stopped. Now, if that wasn't scary enough, we stood there for several minutes trying to compose ourselves when I noticed one of the teachers was staring off at one of the corners of the room. Curious, I looked over at the same corner she was staring at, and I could see a figure of a young woman standing there. But none of the other teachers seemed to notice her. The young woman, who looked to be around 19, stood there staring back at us, and then she slowly began to move towards us. It was then I noticed that her clothes looked tattered, and I thought maybe she was homeless. She was wearing one of those jean jackets, a floral shirt, and a black shirt. She had black shoulder-length hair and was very pretty. She stood there staring at us, and I could see that her mouth was moving, yet no sound came out. As I continued to stare at her pale face, the power went out, and then we heard a woman's ear-piercing scream reverberate through the monitor, causing the other teachers to panic. It was at this point I feel somebody standing next to me, and their cold hands grab at my arm, gripping it tightly. At first, I thought it was one of the other teachers, but at that moment, the lights came back on and reality hit me. It wasn't one of the teachers. I then felt a burning pain on my arm, so I looked down and I noticed a bright red mark circling my arm. We immediately left the room and I notified the employee at the front at what just transpired. But he didn't seem surprised at all. He then apologized to us profusely and offered us a refund. When I got home that night, my arm was still sore, but the bright red mark was finally fading away. Unable to sleep, I went online so I could research the karaoke bar. I found everything the teacher told us was true. A former employee did stab 10 people, killing 5, and there was a woman who was murdered in the ladies' restroom by her jealous husband. What she didn't tell us, though, was that last year, on the first anniversary of the stabbings, they found the body of a young woman in the karaoke bar. She was discovered in room 7 and was later identified as the daughter of the manager who fired the employee. After the creepy encounter at that place, I will never set foot in that karaoke bar again. Anyway, I'm feeling tired, so for now, I'm heading to bed. But I promise to keep you guys updated. About 3 Halloweens ago, a bunch of us were hanging out in this really popular bar that catered to foreigners. One person we were hanging out with was an army friend of ours who, at the time, was stationed at an army base right outside of the city called Gyeongchon. In order to protect my friend's identity, I will not reveal the name of the city base he was stationed at. Although my friend Steve was normally a very social person, on this night in question, he seemed distant. As the night wore on, he started to get agitated at everyone and everything. I had enough of his attitude and finally broke down and asked him what the hell his problem was, but he ignored me. At this point, he began to shake violently, and it took us a few minutes or so to finally get him to calm down. Afterwards, he was able to tell us about something that had happened to him a few days ago. As you guys know, I'm an MP in the Army. Well, about 3 days ago, I was assigned guard duty at the main munitions building that was located in the secluded area of the base. Recently, there had been a string of break-ins, and the higher-ups wanted to tighten up security to ensure no weapons were being stolen, and of course, to catch the culprit red-handed. On this particular night, though, there was 4 of us assigned to guard duty. I remember it vividly, as the nights were breezy and the skies were clear. Me and one other MP, Chris, were placed near the front of the gates, while the other two MPs patrolled the surrounding area. As Chris and I chatted about football, we got a call from one of the MPs patrolling the building. He seemed scared shitless as he yelled at us to hurry up to the munitions building, that somebody was trying to break in again. We quickly notified our sergeant about the possible break-in and ran over to where the other MPs were. When we found the other guys, they were both standing there frozen in place and staring at the munitions building like they had both just seen ghosts. As if on cue, I heard some noises coming from the building and asked them why they were just standing there, but of course, I got no reply. Steve and I, being the brave ones, decided to go investigate to find out what the hell was making all that racket and scaring the other MPs. As we cautiously approached the building, we could hear that someone or something was definitely inside of it. Drawing our weapons, we both shouted for whoever it was to show themselves, and of course, nobody came out. Entering the building, we used our flashlights to see inside the room. At first, we didn't see anything, but then we heard it. The same noise from before, and that's when we saw her. She was standing there with her back turned towards us, and I could see that she had black hair which seemed to be tied up in a bun. She wore one of those traditional Korean dresses which appeared to be dirty and a bit tattered. I yelled out to her, "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here. This is government property. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave, and if you don't comply, I'll have to arrest you for trespassing." I added the last part, hoping that she understood what I was saying and leave, but that wasn't the case. She stood there silently as she began to slowly turn around until she was facing me, and when I saw her face, I froze. Instead of a face, there was nothing but skin. No nose, no mouth, just skin. I stood there unable to move as I felt the surge of electricity course through my body. Finally, we were able to break our trance as we slowly backed out of the munitions building, never once taking our eyes off that woman. Then, she let out a wail as she began to move towards us. No, more like glide towards us, because I noticed that her feet weren't touching the ground. Running out of the building, we nearly collided with our sergeant, but as we glanced behind us, we noticed that the woman was gone. We, along with our sergeant, went back inside the building to see if she was inside, and of course, it was empty. He then asked the MP who witnessed the whole thing what happened, and he told us his version. As he was patrolling the area, he noticed that the motion sensor lights were going crazy. When he was scanning the area for the culprit, he noticed a woman walking towards the munitions building. Before he could stop her, she turned around, and that's when he got a good look at her face, or lack thereof, and nearly shit himself. This was when he radioed in for us. The sergeant wrote up a report and told us off the record that the higher-ups were thinking about closing this building up. Apparently, there's been a lot of weird stuff happening here, and we weren't the first people to see this woman, and that there's been sightings of her since the start of the Korean War. Rumor has it that the woman was once in love with an American soldier, and they would have their nightly rendezvous, where the munitions building is now. One day, after discovering she was pregnant, she told him the news, but he wasn't having any of it and he broke it off with her. Distraught over the breakup, she jumped into a nearby river and drowned herself. Ever since then, she's been haunting this place. After sharing his story with us, his face seemed to soften up, but after a few minutes became worrisome. He added that although it had been a week or so since the encounter, he's been seeing her everywhere. That was 3 years ago, and I heard Steve move back to the States. I also heard after his ghostly encounter, he was never the same again. Anyway, that's my story for you. I'll keep you guys updated with the strange stuff I've encountered. I'm sorry I haven't been updating lately, but I've been so busy, and yesterday I suddenly remembered an incident that happened to me while I was living in Seoul. I forgot to mention to you guys that just prior to moving to Busan, I did live in Seoul for a couple of months. Several strange things happened to me while living there, but I'll share this story with you guys first. Within a few days of arriving in Seoul, I found a very cheap apartment. To get an idea what the apartment complex looked like, well, just imagine the movie Dark Water. It looked exactly like the building in the movie, It was very old and was probably, I'm guessing, built around the late 50s. On top of that, it looks pretty run down, but it was convenient for me, as it was located near the school I would be teaching English at. I occupied an apartment on the 14th floor, and a week before I moved in, the previous tenant had left without ever telling the landlord, and even leaving all of his stuff behind. Anyway, the first few days there were uneventful. It was on the 4th night that I started experiencing some weird stuff. I had to get up early the next day, so I decided to go to bed early. Well, around 11:30, something woke me out of my sleep. As my eyes were adjusting to the dark, I could clearly see a figure of a man standing at the foot of my bed, and he was staring at me. Scared, I quickly reached for the lamp next to me, and as soon as I switched it on, the man was gone. It was around this time I started to notice a foul odor lingering on my floor. It was like nothing I've smelled before. The closest I could describe it is raw meat that's been left out of the refrigerator for several days. I couldn't quite pinpoint where it was coming from, and it seemed to be contained on the 14th floor. I notified my landlord after a few days, and he simply said to me it was an old building that they were having issues with sewage backing up in some of the old units. Oh, did I mention? He spoke English. Anyway, after living there for nearly a week, I began to hear loud banging coming from the apartment next door. It was a thud at first. At first, the bangings were subtle, but they began to get progressively loud, like somebody was continuously punching them. Finally, after a week of this nonsense, I got fed up and notified my landlord. This time, he actually came up to my floor so that he could check out the apartment, but after a thorough search, he found nothing. Eventually, the banging stopped next door and I had several days of peace, although it wouldn't last long. I just got home from work, and I was in the lobby waiting for the elevator, and despite the building being old, the elevators were fairly modern. There were monitors mounted next to each of the elevators, and you could see whoever was riding them. Anyway, as I was waiting for the elevator to arrive, I was bored, so I began to stare at the monitor, and that's when I saw the man. He looked Korean and appeared to be in his early 30s. He was very handsome wearing a suit, and he reminded me of one of those K-drama actors. I continued watching him on the monitor until the elevator arrived, and when the doors opened, it was empty. How could that be? I was watching him the entire time, but now he's gone? I was shaking, I was on the verge of tears, but I still had to take the elevator because the fire escape was locked. Just before stepping inside, though, I looked at the monitors again, and there he was, clear as day. Yet the elevator itself was empty. I was seriously freaking out as I was trying to find a rational explanation, but concluded that this was probably a glitch in the monitor. Besides, I wanted to hurry up and get home to the safety of my bed. As the elevator was getting closer to my floor, it suddenly got really cold, and that was when I heard someone whistling next to my ear. It didn't sound like a happy whistle at all, but more sinister. Regardless of how it sounded, it didn't matter to me at all, because all I wanted to do was get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. I began to press all the buttons in a panic. When I heard the ding indicating we arrived on my floor, I quickly exited the elevator. I was going to make a mad dash to my apartment, but something stopped me. To confirm my fears, I slowly turned around and saw that the man was now back inside the elevator. And oh, was he tall as his head nearly reached the top of the elevator. As he stood staring at me, he began to whistle again, but this time it was even louder. I fiddled for my keys as I slowly backed away, but never taking my eyes off him, not even once. Each time I took a step back, he took a step forward, moving his body in jerky motions, reminding me of one of those marionettes. Somehow I regained some of my courage and I made a mad dash for my apartment. The man began to chase me as I ran as fast as I could until I reached my door. As I fumbled with my keys, I turned around to see if the man was still there. But he was gone. After the encounter with the strange man, I was plagued by nightmares. But when I woke up, I couldn't remember anything about my dreams. I would also see this strange man everywhere I went, including my apartment. But the final straw came when one night I was having trouble sleeping. I went into the kitchen to get a glass of milk to help me get to sleep when I heard what sounded like two men arguing next door. It was already late, so I couldn't call the landlord, so, like an idiot, I decided to confront the noisy neighbors myself. I approached their front door and started to bang on it pretty hard, but nobody answered. I knew they were in there because I could still hear them arguing. "I know you're in there. It's late and I'm trying to get some sleep, so you could please keep it down, or I'm calling the police," I shouted at them. That's when I heard a man yelling, like he was being hurt, and I started to bang on the door, but just as it started, it stopped. I was so scared. After several hard kicks to the door, I finally opened it. As I entered the apartment, I was hit by the same foul odor from before, which caused me to gag. On closer inspection of the apartment, I realized that it was empty, and judging by the state of it, had been for probably a while. At this point, I was seriously freaking out because where did the voices come from? Anyway, I noticed that the layout was similar to mine, so I was able to navigate through without any trouble. I began searching the rooms, starting with the living room, the kitchen, then the bedroom. All the rooms were clear until I searched the bathroom and found the source of the odor. As you can imagine, I started to scream. In the tub lay a decomposing body of what I guessed is a man, and appeared to have been there for a while. After the police arrived, my landlord arrived too, and they questioned both of us. Fortunately, they were able to find the driver's license of the man, and the landlord was able to positively identify him as the previous tenant. Eventually, the police showed me the man's driver's license, and when I saw it, I froze because, you see, it was the same man from the elevator. I found out later that his name was Mr. Kim. He apparently had a gambling problem and he owed money to several people. Anyway, I had never found out how he died, but on a side note, after discovering Mr. Kim's body, I lived there for another month, and I never had anything weird happen there again. Oh, did I mention? The landlord told me that while I was there, I was the only tenant living on the 14th floor. Now that's scary. As I've mentioned to you guys before, I live in Seoul, where I taught English for several months. To get an idea what the school where I taught looked like, well, just picture the school in the movie Death Bell, and you'd get this school. Not very descriptive, I know, but anyway. It was way larger than the one in Busan, and had a lot more buildings that were no longer in use except for storage. From the moment I started teaching at this school, I began experiencing weird shit. The morning of my first day at the school, I decided to check out my classroom before my class was to start. When I opened the door, I saw a girl that looked to be around 16 or 17, sitting at one of the desks. I assumed she was one of those punctual students, so I thought nothing of it. I mean, it was just a school day. Anyway, I said good morning to her but got no reply, so I thought maybe she was just shy. I walked over to my desk without once taking my eyes off of her. As I sat down, I briefly looked down, and when I looked back up again, she was gone. Of course, I was a bit freaked out because I never heard the door open, not even once. You know, now that I think about it, I don't even recall seeing her face either. Strange, huh? I was a month into my teaching when the next thing happened. I had just returned from a week-long break, so I needed to prepare for some of the assignments for class the next day. It was around 6 at night, and the only other people there at the time were a couple of janitors and some security guards. Anyway, I was really immersed in my work when I heard what sounded like somebody walking up and down the hallway wearing high heels. Now, me being the only female there at the time, I assumed someone broke into the school. I immediately ran out into the hallway to find that it was empty, but I could still hear the footsteps, which sounded like they were at the end of the hall. Then, they changed course, and I could hear them heading back in my direction. I was seriously freaking out at this point, as the footsteps were getting closer, but when they reached me, they suddenly stopped. Although I couldn't see anything, I knew that whatever was making those footsteps was right in front of me. Scared shitless, I ran back into the classroom and called security. They did a thorough search of the school, but they never found anything. Oh, did I mention? The school was once used as a hospital during the 50s. Another teacher here had her very own experience at the school. She was staying late to finish some work. Except for the security guards and janitors, she was alone too. It was around 7:30, and she was almost finished but needed to go to the main office to get some copies. She stepped into the hallway, and as she was passing a set of stairs that led into the abandoned third floor, she saw this red ball bouncing down the steps and thought, what the hell? Now, the creepy thing is that the floor had been closed off for several years, and so there's no way a ball could be bouncing down those stairs, but yet it did. When she bent down to pick it up, she said she heard what sounded like a child laughing upstairs. Needless to say, she left without making those copies. This other story I'm about to share happened to an office administrator who worked at the school, and they swear this really happened. Well, several years ago, the school was receiving these really weird calls. At first, it started with maybe 1 or 2 calls a week, then the calls steadily increased to 6 or 7 a day. Well, he started answering these calls, and the first few, he told me, were dead air. As the calls increased, he said he could hear voices on the other line, and this lasted for 2 months. But the call that unnerved him was one of the last calls that came in. As usual, the calls started coming in, and of course, he picks up the phone. But as he's putting the receiver to his ear, he could hear what sounded like a woman screaming for help. Using his cell phone, he immediately calls the police, and somehow they're able to trace the call, and where the calls were coming from sent shivers down my spine. They were coming from an office in the school that had been closed off for 10 years. Still creeps me out every time I think about it. The last story I'm going to share with you happened to me. This was my last month at the school, and like usual, I was there pretty early. As I'm walking to my classroom, I see one of the teachers standing near the entrance to the basement, with her back towards me. I called out to her, but she just stood there. Thinking she didn't hear me, I called out again, and this time she looked back at me. She then turned around and walked down the stairs to the basement. Something seemed off about her, as she was usually a very lively person, so crazy me decides to follow her down to the basement, and despite there being minimal lighting, I could see her in front of me. She continued to walk down the stairs and into the very dark hallway. Then as she's rounding the corner, she stops in front of one of the old classrooms, turns around to look at me, then enters it. I'm getting a really bad feeling, but decide to follow her anyway, and when I enter it, she's nowhere to be seen. I quickly make my way up to the office to report what I just saw, and that's when I was told the bad news, that she was found dead the night before. Anyway, I have an early morning tomorrow, so I'll end it here, but I'll try to keep you guys posted. Okay, here's another strange encounter I'd like to share with you. This happened to me last summer at this really popular beach here in Busan. I was on my summer break from teaching, and during that time I would often hang out with some of the other teachers. We'd barbecue and go fishing, fun stuff like that. Well, as our summer break was coming to an end, we decided to have an end-of-semester party at this beach in Busan. It was going to be 20 of us, and we planned on camping for 5 days. Anyway, the first night was a blast. We got drunk, roasted marshmallows, and told ghost stories around the barbecue grill. To prevent a fire, we didn't start a real campfire. As the night was winding down, we all started to get sleepy and decided to retreat to our tents, where I immediately fell asleep. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps outside my tent, so of course, I stepped out to check it out. That's when I see one of the other English teachers, a guy named John, who's from Canada, standing near the water with his eyes transfixed on something. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. I watched him for several minutes until he finally turned around and walked back to his tent without even saying a word to me. As you can imagine, this creeped me out a bit. Anyway, just before going back to my own tent, I scanned the area of the water he was looking at, but unfortunately, it was really too dark for me to see anything, but I did hear something loud splashing in the water. The next morning when I saw John, I asked him why he was standing outside at 1 a.m. and what he was looking at, but he just looked at me and asked what the hell I was talking about. I shrugged my shoulders and I said never mind. The rest of the day was, of course, uneventful, but as soon as it got dark, that's when shit started getting crazy. So once again, we're all sitting by the barbecue grill talking, when we all hear these very loud splashes in the water, and this continued for 15 minutes. When the splashing finally stopped, some of us braver souls with cell phones in hand went to check it out, and that's when we saw the things in the water. At first we mistook them for rocks. That is, until they started rising out of the water. From where we stood, we could see that they were women, at least 30 of them. These women weren't normal, and this fact became obviously clear when we saw their glowing eyes. Their hair was long and matted, and oh God, they smelled awful. The women creatures began to hiss as they approached our tents. All of us began running in all directions as the creatures tried to catch up to us. As I was running away, I could hear several of the people behind me screaming. I finally was far away from the beach where I could stop for a second to catch my breath. As I was hunched over, I felt wet hands grab my arms, and when I turned around, I saw one of the women creatures. Her smell was overpowering, and I began to gag. It was then that she began to pull me in the direction of the water. But I knew if I didn't try to stop her, that I would soon be joining the dead. Although I wasn't a religious person, I began saying the Lord's Prayer, hoping this would work, and it must have, because she soon released my arm, leaving behind painful gashes. When everything was said and done, we all gathered together and called the police. 6 of us were unaccounted for, including John. After we filed our report, we gathered all of our belongings because there was no way in hell we were going to stay there another second. During the drive home, we notified the families of our missing friends, and let me tell you, that was painful to do. Later on, I did some research on that beach and learned that there had been over 200 drownings in the last 68 years. Legend says that during the Korean War, there was a woman who, for circumstances unknown, was drowned by her husband on this beach. Shortly after her death, people began drowning on that beach increasingly, and witnesses claimed to see a young woman pulling the victims into the waters just before they drowned. Soon, that number would change, and people would claim to see several women pulling their unsuspecting victim into the waters. It was also around this time that beachgoers reported sightings of a woman with long, matted hair and weird glowing eyes. The people who lived nearby claimed that they would hear what they could only describe as a banshee screaming, seemingly through the night. This caused the homeowners to abandon their pricey beachfront homes and flee the area altogether. Eventually, bodies were being found on the beach at an alarming rate, and not just drowning victims, but homicide victims too. It was also rumored that during the crash of 2008, one homeowner who lived on the beach was found dead at the exact same spot where we were camping at. Although at first it looked like a suspicious death. They eventually ruled it as a suicide, as he was about to lose his home and file for bankruptcy. Oh, here's an update on John, or the other 5 people missing from the camping trip. Although they're all still missing, apparently several articles of clothing and a cell phone that belonged to John washed up on the beach. And lately here, I've been receiving calls from John's cell phone, and one time, I actually received a voice message. It said, "Help me." I would love to hear your opinions on what you think it was we saw, because I still get freaked out every time I think about it. What I'm about to tell you happened to me while I was vacationing on Jeju Island, which is in Korea. It was during the month of April, and there was a big concert/event happening on Jeju Island. At the time, all the hotels were full because of the event, and since my trip was last minute, I really didn't have time to reserve a room. Anyway, I needed a room, and so I googled hotels in the area to see if maybe there was a room vacant on the island. Otherwise, I'd have to stay at a hostel. Well, just my luck, there was a room available in a hotel on the outskirts of Jeju City, and judging by the pictures that were posted, it seemed like a decent place, but the price was right too. But boy, was I in for a surprise. As I've mentioned before, the hotel was located on the outskirts of Jeju City, surrounded by really thick woods. It was fairly easy to find, and I'm guessing the cab driver was familiar with the place too. Once I paid for my fare, I stepped out of the cab and was able to get a really good look at the place, and let me tell you, it was creepy as hell. Well, to get an idea of what this place looked like, just picture the Overlook Hotel from The Shining, and you'd get this hotel. I'm walking to the entrance of the hotel and I noticed that there were only a few cars in the parking lot. I thought this was strange since the rest of the hotel rooms on Jeju Island were full. I assumed this had something to do with the hotel's location, and so I shrugged it off. As I entered the hotel lobby, I noticed immediately that the man working at the front desk was staring at me. As I'm checking into my room, I could feel his eyes bore into me. He looked mean and only spoke a few times as he was finishing up my transaction. During the entire time, I felt uncomfortable, and all I wanted to do was get to my room. When he finally handed me the keys to room 104, I snatched them out of his hand and ran to my room. Let me tell you that despite the hotel itself being creepy as hell, my room was actually nice and the bed was comfortable too. Needless to say, as soon as I laid my head down on the pillow, I was out. It was around 12 a.m. maybe, when I woke up again to a woman screaming for help, so I jolted myself out of bed. I scanned the area near the bed to make sure nobody else was in the room with me. Then I heard the screams again, and this time they seemed to be coming from my bathroom. Although I was scared shitless, I knew I needed to check it out. Before going to bed though, I remembered turning the bathroom lights off, but now the lights were on again. I could also hear sounds like two people were struggling with each other. Anyway, as I approached the bathroom, I saw the creepy man from the front desk trying to drown a young woman. I screamed, but he didn't seem to hear me as he continued drowning her. And what was sad was that I could actually hear her gasping for air. I must be dreaming, I thought, but no, this felt too real, and I knew I needed to call the police. But when I looked into the bathroom again, nobody was there and the lights were off too. As I sat there on bed waiting for the police to arrive, I heard somebody knocking on the door. I was too scared to even scream, and what made matters worse was whoever was knocking on the door was now trying to get inside my room. I could hear the sound of the keypad as the person on the other side was pressing the buttons, and then there was a click as the door began to open. I tried to find a hiding place, but it was too late as I felt a hand grab me and then throw me down onto the bed. It was the creepy man from the front desk. As I began struggling with him, I thought this was it. I'm going to die, and that's when I noticed something was moving behind him. A pair of ethereal arms, yes, ethereal, wrapped themselves around him and then yanked him off of me, throwing him against the wall, knocking him out. It was the woman from the bathroom. When the police finally arrived, they handcuffed him, searched my room, and discovered hidden cameras everywhere. Apparently, for years he'd been spying on the women staying at the hotel, and he was also a person of interest in the murder of a woman who was found dead in this room several years ago. After taking down my statement, the police escorted the creepy man into their cruiser and left, leaving me alone in the room. I then packed my bag to leave, and when I was finished, I looked back into the room for one last time. I saw the ghost woman who saved me standing there with a smile on her face. Then she vanished. Oh, to give you an update on the creepy man, well, apparently he's a person of interest in several unsolved murders of young women that span the course of 20 years. One of his victims was the niece of one of the cops investigating the murders. They also found items belonging to some of the murdered women in his room he was living at in the hotel. So it's possible that he's a serial killer that's been eluding the Korean authorities for years. Now that he's locked up, so no more innocent women will be hurt. Although I feel lucky, I do fear that one day he'll get out and come looking for me. I know a few of you asked me to update you on the clicking sounds. Well, it's still going on, and now all the teachers are hearing it. Anyway, I've been experiencing some weird stuff lately in school, and even in my apartment. I'll save my apartment for a later time. A lot of teachers here have also been complaining to the principal about hearing the clicking sounds in their apartments too. So here's a rundown on what's been going on at the school so far. I was at school one afternoon to set up for a festival the school was having over the weekend. Of course, I was alone in the room where most of the preparations were taking place. The rest of the people helping out with the festival were outside setting up the booths. Anyway, as I'm making the banners, I started hearing a clicking sound right next to my ear. Then, it starts to get louder to the point I'm covering my ears. I try to run out of the room, but something stops me, like an invisible force holding me back. So I sit there covering my ears, hoping the sound will hurry up and go away. I don't know how long I sat there for, but I do remember everything going black. Next thing I know, I wake up in the school's infirmary. Apparently I'd been out for 2 hours, but they couldn't find anything wrong with me, except for some really mean welts I had on my arms, which I don't remember how I got them. After I recovered from that scary incident, I began to notice one of the students always walking the hallways with her head down. She was a very social girl and well liked by everybody, but something happened to her about 3 months ago that changed her. So about 3 months ago, several of the students were talking about the school, how the school was haunted after one of the students experienced something in the bathroom near the closed-off building. Anyway, this girl who was a skeptic just guffawed at the students. After several minutes of her ridiculing them, they dared her to stay the night in the closed-off section building, and she agreed. So the night came, and she somehow managed to find a way into the building. Although there is an entrance to the basement, it has since been boarded up. Now, what happened to her from the point she entered the building to the moment we found her is unclear, because she and the other students who dared her weren't talking. But what is clear is that she went missing for 2 whole days, and when we did find her, the students involved confessed to us their plan and told us where to find her. She was hiding in a closet in one of the classrooms. When the students confessed to what they've done, the principal ordered all the teachers to search the building and told us that we wouldn't be able to go home until we found her. So naturally, we booked our asses as soon as the maintenance men cut open a hole so that we could all enter that creepy place. We were placed in groups of 2, and I was grouped with the math teacher. We were assigned to the 3rd floor, thank goodness, because I was scared we were going to get the basement, and we had to use flashlights because the lights no longer worked here. Anyway, as we were rounding the corner of the hallway, we saw a boy that looked to be around 16 years old. How did he get in here, I thought, as he stood there staring at us. Then, all of a sudden, we could see him opening his mouth like he's about to talk, but instead, there's nothing but silence. He then opens his mouth even wider, and that's when we hear it. The clicking noise. That was our cue to leave, and so we ran into one of the classrooms down the hall. We hear whimpering coming from the closet. When we opened it, we found the girl, and she appeared visibly shaken. It was a week after that incident, and it was around 4 in the afternoon when I was leaving school. For some reason, I looked back at the school and saw somebody standing near one of the windows in the abandoned building. Let me tell you, I never ran so fast in my life. Around this time, students and teachers both were reporting seeing a boy they didn't recognize all over the school. One student claimed that while he was climbing the stairs to the 2nd floor, he saw the boy standing there blocking the top of the stairs. When the student asked him to kindly move, the boy pushed him down the stairs. Luckily for him, he was able to regain his balance by grabbing the railing and avoiding serious injury to himself. The sightings of the boy were becoming rampant. Another student claimed that she was walking to her class. She saw the boy standing in the middle of the hallway. She said she didn't recognize him, and so she tried to put some distance between them so she could walk around him. That's when he lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and tried to drag her into the basement, but she said a little prayer and he released her. After she escaped, she immediately reported the incident to her teacher. Let me update you on the girl that was missing for 2 days. Well, she'd been acting out and has had several outbursts in class. Students around her say they could hear a really low clicking noise coming from her mouth, like the noise Kayako makes from The Grudge. even if she isn't talking. Other times, students claim to hear the same clicking noise while listening to music or talking on the phone anytime they were near her. About 3 days ago, she transferred to another school. Okay guys, I'm getting scared as I type this, and I swear I could hear a clicking sound coming from my living room. Okay guys, I know it's been a week or so, but here's another update for you. Lately, strange things have been happening in my apartment building. Even my own apartment has been affected, but it's totally unrelated, and a story which I'll save for another time. Anyway, it got so bad I landed in the hospital with a sprained ankle. So here's my story. So about a month ago, a woman, I later learned her name was Mina, in the building died after jumping out of her 6th floor apartment. I didn't know her personally, but I would often see her in the lobby with her boyfriend. At least I assume it was her boyfriend, where I would always wave to her. She looked to be in her early 30s and very pretty, but always seemed sad. Then the rumors started spreading around that she was actually pushed, but of course, there was no way to prove it. Anyway, this is where things start to get weird. A few days after Mina fell to her death, I was walking home from the train station when I heard a woman screaming. When I looked up, I saw somebody falling from the 6th floor of my building, and I thought, not again. By the time I went to the spot where I thought the body fell, the other tenants had already gathered around, but there was no body to be found. Night after night, we'd hear the same screaming woman and even witnessing her fall, to only discover yet again, no body. Not long after, the rumors started spreading that the screaming woman was actually Mina, coming back for revenge. Eventually, the woman, Mina, could be heard at all hours of the night, and it got to the point where people were seeing her apparition everywhere. It was at this time that I noticed her boyfriend had a new lady, and as the sightings of Mina grew, the man began to look more and more haggard. Gradually, though, he began to let himself go, like he wouldn't shave and his clothes looked disheveled. Things were getting progressively worse, and you could actually feel this dark presence throughout the building. One of the tenants, an older lady who lived alone, woke up one morning to find a woman standing over her bed. She stood there staring at the lady for a few minutes before she finally vanished. Another tenant, a young man living in the apartment next door to Mina, woke up one night to her in her bed with him. Although it was dark in the room, the street light outside shone enough light for him to see her face. At first, she looked normal, then her face began to change into something sinister, and naturally this freaked him out. Needless to say, he didn't stay in that room for very long. A tenant who moved into the apartment below Mina's apartment was out on the balcony one night when he claimed he heard somebody above him pacing back and forth. He said he heard 2 people arguing, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. As he stood there listening to them argue, he said he heard a woman's blood-curdling scream. And the next thing he knew, he saw a woman falling. He then said, as he watched her fall, he was able to see that she had a look of sheer panic on her face, and added it was something that he would never forget. Now, the final moment came one morning as I was leaving my apartment. As I was leaving, I was met by Mina's boyfriend. He smelled really bad and he was mumbling incoherently to himself too. Then, out of nowhere, he let out a scream that sent shivers down my spine. He then started to run towards the elevators, and then I knew what he was about to do, so I started to chase him. As I was running, I tripped and fell, spraining my ankle. But before going over the railing, I swear I saw somebody that looked like Mina push him. My stay at the hospital, where I also had encounters with the paranormal, lasted 4 days. And due to the shock I suffered, I developed breathing issues and other complications. Anyway, for those 4 days, I was visited by a young nurse who I didn't recognize. I got to know all the nurses during my stay. She would visit my room every night, and on her third visit I decided to talk to her, and I could see her mouth move, but no sound came out. Then she lifted her hands, pointed in the direction of the nurse's station. Then she vanished. That night, as I was sleeping, I was awoken by the sound of something scratching at the window, but I was too damn scared to look. The scratching lasted till 4 in the morning, when finally I was able to get back to sleep. On my last day at the hospital, I was saying my goodbyes to all the nurses when I spotted a picture at the nurse's station. It was a picture of some of the nurses, and one of them I recognized immediately, as she was the one who was visiting every night. I pointed at the picture and asked one of the nurses who she was, and she told me that she was a nurse that used to work at the hospital, but was killed in a car accident several years ago. Oh, before I forget, they found the lover of Mina's boyfriend dead in her apartment a few days later, and from what I heard, her face was all contorted like something scared her to death. Well, we all know who really killed her, but who's going to believe me if I tell them a vengeful spirit was responsible for her death? Nobody. Anyway, Mina was finally able to get her revenge, and rightly so, because apparently he'd been seeing his mistress for a couple of years. So that's what's been happening to me. Anyway, take care guys, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, as I mentioned to you guys in one of my last updates, the other teachers and I have been experiencing stuff, from hearing the clicking sounds to actually seeing shit. We even had experiences while we were out shopping and stuff. Now, to bring you guys up to date, so you remember about me telling you about the girl we found in the abandoned building, which I'll call Building C for reference. After she went missing for 2 days, well, after we found her hiding in the closet, the paranormal activity seems to have increased, especially in Building C and the areas surrounding it. Okay, to get an idea of what the layout of the school is like, well, there are a total of 6 floors, including the basement. There are classrooms on one side of the stairwell, where Building C is located, and the bathrooms are on the opposite side of the stairwells, which seems to get a lot of activity. There are large wooden boards in place to serve as a divider between Building C and the rest of the school. Both students and teachers have had their fair share of ghostly encounters in this area because it seems this is where most of the activity in the school is taking place. So, let me tell you what's been going on. One day, 2 students were standing next to Building C, when suddenly they heard what sounded like somebody on the other side punching the wall, like punching it so hard and actually causing it to shake. Needless to say, they didn't stick around to find out who or what it was punching the wall. Another time a teacher was walking by the stairwell that leads to the basement. She heard a woman calling her name and assumed it was the PE teacher. When she reached the basement floor, she heard her name again, and although she didn't see anyone, she knew with certainty that she was the only one down there. The next story I'm about to share with you actually happened to me. I was using the stairwell near Building C to go to the 2nd floor when I heard footsteps coming from the stairwell above me. Out of curiosity, I wanted to see who it was, so I raced up the stairs to get a better look, and I see that it's a student, but something seems off about them. Anyway, I could hear their footsteps as I'm racing up the stairs, but when I reached the 6th floor stairwell, it was empty. They couldn't have got past me, I thought, because I would have surely seen them. The last floor is closed off, so there's no place for them to go, and after I realized that, I got the heck out of there. There's another teacher who had a very scary experience in the men's room. It was after school, he said, and all the students had already gone home, so the school was practically empty, except for security and janitors. He said he was about to go home too, when he said he needed to go pee. As he entered the bathroom, he noticed it was empty. After he was done peeing, he walked over to the sinks to wash his hands, and was surprised to see there was another man in the bathroom. As the teacher approached him, he said the man's head suddenly sprung up, and when he looked in the mirror, he had no face. Both the students and staff also witnessed the lights in Building C flickering on and off. Another time, there was a couple who were walking their dog. As they were passing the school, their dog started to growl. and then they heard what sounded like a woman screaming inside the school. They immediately called the police, and when they arrived, they searched the whole school but found nothing. The weird thing was that nobody who was inside the school at the time heard the screaming. Soon, the rumors began to spread throughout the school that Building C was legitimately haunted. After some students managed to break into Building C, they managed to remove the boards from the door in the basement. A security post was placed inside the basement. The school had hired 5 guards to watch the basement in case the students tried to break into Building C again, and it became apparent that something was definitely wrong with the basement after the guards began to have their own experiences. One of the guards was doing his rounds in the basement when he heard a loud ding. He saw the doors to a really old elevator open. He said inside the elevator were several people dressed in 50s-style clothing. Another guard was making his rounds, and as he was walking past the door that led to Building C, is when he saw the door begin to shake violently. As he approached it, he saw a face through the window staring back at him. Eventually, the school hired several more guards in order to patrol Building C after several of the neighboring houses began to complain about weird noises coming from the school. It was for this reason that the principal asked of us if this Friday, if any of us would like to stay one night in Building C, as the school was thinking about reopening it due to the overpopulation. And despite the school offering a huge bonus, nobody volunteered, so I did. It wasn't like I was going to be alone, because there'd be several guards patrolling the building all throughout the night. When the dreaded night finally arrived, I was taken to the infirmary that was located on the 3rd floor in Building C. It was pretty close to the stairwell in case I needed to make a hasty retreat, and I was also given a walkie and a new bed to sleep on. The infirmary was an average size and looked fairly clean, despite the building being closed off for all those years. Anyway, I was in for the night. I had brought my laptop, some books, and toiletries, so I was set. It was around 11 when I started to feel drowsy and decided to call it a night. As I was drifting off to sleep, I heard what sounded like something scuttling around. I scanned the room to see where it was coming from, and that's when I saw something crawling on the walls. The lighting was poor, so I pulled my phone out to get a better look. I took a deep breath and shined my light on the thing. What I saw will haunt me forever. It looked like a woman, yet it wasn't a woman. But whatever that thing was, it was hideous. It reminded me of the one woman from The Ring, and I could see she/it was crawling towards me, not once taking her eyes off me. I began to panic as she was getting closer to me, and as she moved, I could hear her body making these weird cracking sounds. She continued to crawl towards me until she got right on top of me. When I woke up the next morning, there were several guards hovering over me. They came to check on me after they heard screaming coming from their walkies. A few days later, I was at home taking a shower, and I got some soap in my eyes. As I was rubbing the soap out, I noticed a face next to mine, and every time I rubbed my eyes, I saw the face. Another time I was taking a shower. After I finished, I turned off the water and noticed the water wasn't going down. When I checked the drain, I saw there was some long black hair stuck inside. My hair's not black. The final straw came one night as I was dreaming. In the dream, there was a fire in my apartment building and I could hear people screaming. I remember having a hard time breathing and eventually collapsing from smoke inhalation. When I woke up from my dream, I swear I could smell smoke, and after checking my apartment for a fire, I was relieved to find there was none. But as I was getting ready for work, I got a call from the school telling me there was a fire at the school. After the fire was finally put out, there was nothing left of Building C, but the other buildings were somehow miraculously spared. The next day, I turned in my resignation. So, this will be my last update, because I'll be moving back to Hawaii, but I'd like to thank you guys for all of your advice. You really helped me a lot. Maybe I'll share with you some of the strange thing I experienced in Hawaii, but until then, take care.
Chronicler here. We here at Creepy Spaghet would like to thank Gdokim for allowing us to tell their story. If you liked this story, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on these terrible tales. and make sure to check out the author in the links below. If you're interested in having your story narrated, be sure to reach out to our humble overseer, as he continues his journey to pull the darkest stories from the infinite depths of the internet. Until next time, fiends, and remember, we are darkness.